You know, back in the years right after World War II, America felt unstoppable. The war had ended, soldiers had come home, and the country was buzzing with energy. Factories that once built tanks and ships now turned their fire and muscle toward peace, building cars, bridges, skyscrapers, and railroads. And at the center of it all was steel. Steel wasn't just a material, it was the backbone of the nation. It was in the beams of every new highway bridge, the frame of every Chevrolet rolling off the line in Detroit, the skeleton of every skyscraper rising into the sky. People used to say, "As goes steel, so goes America." And for a time, that was true. Cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Gary, Indiana became the beating heart of this steel empire. If you drove into those towns in the 1950s, you could see the glow of the furnaces from miles away. At night, the sky itself seemed to burn with orange and red, as if the horizon had caught fire. Locals would tell you they didn't need a clock to know the time. The shift whistle from the mill told them everything. Daily life was built around the rhythm of those mills. Men poured into the gates every morning, lunch pails in hand, boots heavy with dust. The sound of the shift siren echoed across neighborhoods, signaling the start and end of long, grueling days. Kids in those towns grew up falling asleep to the distant hum of machinery and the hiss of steam. Even the smell was unforgettable. Hot metal, coal smoke, and iron dust mixed into the air, settling onto clothes, cars, and even the porch swing where families sat after dinner. For the people living through it, there was a sense of pride. Sure, the work was hard, sometimes backbreaking, but they knew they were part of something bigger, something that built America's highways, powered its cars, and even strengthened its defense during uneasy Cold War years. Steel was more than an industry. It was an identity, a way of life, and a promise that tomorrow could be better than today. Life in the steel towns of the 1950s and 60s followed a rhythm all its own. Everything, meals, school schedules, even church bells, seemed to bend around the mill's shifts. A workday often stretched to 10 or 12 hours. Men would leave before sunrise, their breath showing in the cold morning air, boots crunching on gravel as they walked toward the gates. Inside, the blast furnaces roared like dragons, spewing heat and sparks. The noise was deafening, hammers pounding, molten steel rushing like a river of fire, cranes screeching overhead. Conversations were short, shouted above the din. Safety gear was primitive compared to today. Thick gloves, helmets, and leather aprons, but little to guard against the choking smoke and dust that clung to the skin. When a man came home, his clothes carried the smell of the mill, burnt metal, coal, and sweat. His face was darkened with soot that soap never quite erased. But for all its hardship, there was dignity in that grime. It was proof of honest work. Neighborhoods reflected that same spirit. Rows of small houses, often built by the company itself, lined the streets. The yards were modest, with clotheslines stretched from one post to another, laundries swaying in the breeze. Kids rode their bikes through alleys, while mothers gathered on porches, sharing news and gossip. Everyone knew everyone else, because in one way or another, they all lived by the mill's whistle. Sundays were sacred. For many families, it meant church in the morning, a hearty meal in the afternoon, and maybe a drive to the local ice cream stand if the kids behaved. It was a day to rest sore backs, polish shoes, and forget about the blast furnace for just a little while. Culture thrived in small ways too. There were bowling leagues, union picnics, and high school football games that lit up entire towns on Friday nights. The mills might have defined the work week, but the community found its joy in these simple traditions. And for many, the dream was straightforward: steady work, a safe home, kids who could do better than their parents. In those years, steel towns weren't just industrial landscapes. They were living, breathing communities, woven together by sweat, hope, and the belief that building America's future was worth every drop of effort poured into those molten rivers of iron. Back in those years, steel wasn't just a job. It was a badge of honor. To work in the mill was to stand shoulder to shoulder with the very strength of America itself. Men carried themselves with a quiet pride, knowing the bridges they helped build connected cities, the cars they made possible carried families across wide highways, and the skyscrapers they supported reached for the heavens. In towns like Pittsburgh, you could see that pride everywhere. Union halls stood at the heart of the community, their walls covered with photographs of parades, strikes, and victories hard won. Those halls weren't just meeting places, they were symbols of solidarity. Workers believed in looking out for one another, in fighting for fair wages and safe conditions. The unions gave voice to men who might otherwise have been silent, and for many families, the union card was as important as a passport. Patriotism was woven tightly into daily life. During the Cold War, when tension with the Soviet Union ran high, steel workers saw themselves as part of the front line, not with rifles, but with furnaces. They supplied the strength behind America's tanks, planes, and ships. There was a sense that every shift, every slab of steel rolled out of the mills was another brick in the fortress of freedom. And yet, pride wasn't only about defense. It was also about progress. When President Eisenhower announced the creation of the interstate highway system in 1956, steel workers knew they were helping to shape the very bones of modern America. Every mile of highway, every overpass, every bridge was a monument to their labor. In living rooms across steel towns, you'd find families watching the evening news on black and white TVs, fathers pointing at the screen with calloused hands, telling their children, "See that bridge? That's steel from our mill." It gave meaning to the long hours and the aching muscles. It made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. For a time, America's confidence was reflected in the glow of the furnaces. To be part of that world was to believe deeply that you were helping to build something bigger than yourself, something that would last for generations. Steel towns weren't only about smoke and furnaces. They had their own heartbeat, their own culture, shaped by the mills but full of life beyond them. In Pittsburgh, you could feel that connection everywhere. The city's pride showed up not just in the skyline, but on the ball fields. The Pittsburgh Steelers carried the very name of the industry on their helmets, and when the team played, mill workers filled the stands, still smelling faintly of iron and sweat, cheering with a roar that matched the blast furnaces. In the summer, baseball belonged to the Pirates, and families crowded into Ford's Field with hot dogs and peanuts, taking a break from the grind to celebrate America's pastime. After shifts, men often gathered in corner bars or little diners, their paychecks still warm in their pockets. A cold, cheap beer tasted like relief after 12 hours in the heat. The jukebox played jazz, then rock and roll as the 60s rolled in, and you could see young couples tapping their feet, dreaming of something bigger, while older men argued about the union or the latest ball game. Sundays, of course, belonged to the church. Bells rang through the neighborhoods, calling families together. It was one of the few times a steel worker would swap his sooty clothes for a pressed shirt and polished shoes, sitting in the pew with his family, grateful for a moment of peace. And for the younger generation, life carried a lighter rhythm. Drive-in theaters popped up across Pennsylvania and Ohio. Teens would pile into Chevrolets and Fords, pulling up to giant outdoor screens, radios tuned in, watching Elvis Presley shake his hips or John Wayne ride across the prairie. For many, it was their first taste of freedom, the romance of the car, the music of the times, and the thrill of being young in a town built on steel. This was the culture that surrounded the mills, a mix of sweat and celebration, tradition and change. Steel may have set the schedule, but it never stopped people from finding joy in the simple rituals of American life. The 1950s and 60s were years when steel felt larger than life, tied directly to the great stories of America itself. Every headline seemed to carry a reflection of the mills. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, launching the interstate highway system. It would stretch across thousands of miles, linking towns and states in ways never seen before. But behind the dream of those open roads lay steel, millions of tons of it. Every overpass, every bridge, every stretch of reinforced concrete depended on the men in the mills. For families living in steel towns, driving down a new interstate wasn't just a trip, it was riding on the work of their fathers and neighbors. And then there was the automobile boom. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler rolled out millions of cars each year, all built on American steel. The roar of a Chevy engine, the shine of a polished Cadillac, these weren't just machines, they were symbols of prosperity, proof that the nation was moving forward. In driveways across the Midwest, a new car meant a family had arrived, and somewhere behind that gleaming hood ornament was a steelworker's hand. And then there was the Cold War. The world felt tense, uncertain, and America leaned heavily on its industry. Steel became part of the arsenal of democracy. Again, tanks, planes, warships, even missiles, all demanded the steady stream of metal pouring from Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Gary. For steelworkers, it wasn't just another shift. It felt like service, a duty to keep the country strong, to hold the line against a distant threat. These events weren't abstract. They were woven into daily conversations. In union halls, men talked about contracts and overtime, but also about Eisenhower's highways, Detroit's latest model, and what it meant to stand firm against the Soviets. Families sitting in living rooms watching the evening news could point at the screen and say, "That's our steel." For a while, it seemed as if the nation's destiny and the steel mill's fires burned in unison, bright, unstoppable, and full of promise. But for all the pride, there was a price. Life in steel towns carried shadows that couldn't be ignored. The air itself told the story. Skies over Pittsburgh were often a permanent gray, thick with smoke and soot from the mills. Locals used to joke that if you wore a white shirt in the morning, it would be black by evening. Laundry hung on the line came down streaked with dust, and a fine layer of grit clung to windowsills, porches, and even the leaves of backyard trees. To visitors, it looked like pollution. To families who lived there, it was simply part of the landscape, proof the mills were running strong. Inside the mills, conditions were harsh. Temperatures near the furnaces soared high enough to blister skin, and the roar of machines drowned out nearly every sound. Safety rules were minimal compared to today. A wrong step could mean burns, broken bones, or worse. Every neighborhood had stories of accidents: an uncle who lost a finger, a neighbor who never came home from a shift. Health carried its own toll. Workers developed chronic coughs, lungs scarred by years of breathing in dust and smoke. Some called it the mill cough, a rasp that clung to men long after they retired. Doctors knew what it meant, but remedies were few. Still, most shrugged it off. They said, "That's just steel. That's just the job." Yet despite the dangers, most didn't complain. Wages were steady, and for many families, better than what their parents had known. A mill paycheck could buy a modest house, put food on the table, and even send children to college, a dream that felt out of reach for earlier generations. The work was punishing, but it promised a future. In the end, the hardships became part of the story too. Men carried scars, lungs carried dust, and homes carried soot. But families also carried pride. For them, the balance was worth it. They were building something lasting, even if the cost was written on their own bodies. By the early 1970s, the signs of change were subtle at first, like a faint crack in a strong beam, easy to miss but impossible to ignore once you noticed. Foreign steel began arriving on American shores, cheaper and often of equal quality.
Japan, Germany, and later South Korea were rebuilding their industries with modern equipment, while many American mills were still running on machinery that dated back to the 1920s and 30s. The furnaces and rolling lines that had once been state-of-the-art were now aging giants, costly to repair and difficult to modernize. At the same time, the nation itself was changing. The oil crisis sent energy costs soaring. Environmental regulations tightened, forcing mills to invest in cleaner, safer operations, improvements that required money many companies weren't ready to spend. Labor unions fought to protect wages and benefits, but negotiations sometimes turned into bitter strikes that left both sides bruised. In steel towns, families began to notice small shifts. Overtime hours, once plentiful, grew scarce. A neighbor might be laid off for a few weeks at a time, then called back, then let go again. Coffee shop chatter carried a nervous edge. The certainty that the mill would always provide, a belief as solid as the steel, began to wobble. And yet, life continued much as before. Kids still played baseball in the street until the streetlights flickered on. Churches still filled on Sundays. On Friday nights, the mill still lit up the valley with their glowing furnaces. But in the back of people's minds, a quiet worry lingered. What if this doesn't last? What if the golden days are slipping away? That question, once whispered, would soon grow louder. The 1970s were only the beginning of a storm that would shake the very foundations of steel country. By the 1980s, the storm had fully arrived. One by one, the great mills that had once roared with fire and iron fell silent. Gates that had swung open for thousands of workers each morning were now chained shut. Neighborhoods around Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Cleveland, and Buffalo began to hollow out. What had been the proud Steel City was now called part of the Rust Belt, a name that carried both bitterness and mourning. Families who had once thrived on mill wages faced hard choices. Some packed up and moved south or west, chasing jobs in auto plants, construction, or the growing service sector. Others stayed, holding on to shrinking pensions, watching storefronts close and schools struggle. And yet, amid the hardship, there was a deep sense of pride that never left. Retired steelworkers would gather at diners or union halls, sipping black coffee, trading stories of 12-hour shifts and molten rivers of steel. They remembered the searing heat, the grit, the danger, but also the satisfaction of walking out at the end of the day knowing they had built something real, something lasting. The legacy of American steel could still be seen everywhere. It rose in the bridges spanning the Mississippi, in the skyscrapers piercing the skyline of New York and Chicago, in the battleships that once guarded the seas. Even as the mills cooled, the steel they produced remained woven into the very bones of the nation. And for those who lived through it, the memories glowed like embers. The night skies above Pittsburgh painted red by blast furnaces, the wail of shift whistles echoing through the valley, the rhythm of a life measured in shifts, paychecks, and pride. Today, when older Americans look back, they speak with a mixture of sorrow and honor. We were steelworkers. We built America. And though the mills may be gone, that steel is still standing strong. You know, back then, it wasn't easy. 12 hours a day, the heat so fierce it could melt the skin off your bones, and the smoke hanging in the air so thick you carried it home on your clothes. But we were proud. We had steady work, we fed our families, and we knew that every beam, every sheet of steel rolling out of those mills was building America. I still remember the nights when the sky over Pittsburgh burned red like the whole city was on fire. To us, that glow meant work. It meant strength. It meant a future. We didn't complain much. Sure, it was dangerous, and sure, it wore us down, but those paychecks bought homes, sent kids to college, and put food on the table. Now the mills are quiet. The whistles don't blow anymore. The neighborhoods aren't what they used to be. But when I drive across a bridge made of steel or see the skyscrapers shining in the city, I smile. Because I know I was part of that. We all were. We were steel workers. We built this country with our hands, with sweat, and with pride. And even though the mills are gone, that steel is still standing strong. And so are we.